Valerie Ling. I'm a clinical psychologist and I'm your host for the Clergy Wellbeing Down Under podcast. I'm looking forward to interviewing an expert today to take you through my findings from my research where I asked 200 pastors down under how they were doing. Don't forget to subscribe, like and share. Buckle up and here we go. Welcome to Dr. Grant Bickerton. Hi, Grant.
Hey, Valerie. Good to see you.
Good to see you. It's been 10 years. This is what I figured out. 10 years since we have met one another. And
wow.
Yeah. 10 years. Could you tell us a little bit about you, your role, and where you are?
Yes. I serve with a Christian mission organisation called Power to Change, formerly known as Campus Crusade for Christ. And my role with them is particularly around the development and the well-being of our missionaries. But my background is as a psychologist, and I spent some time doing my PhD research looking into particularly what role does organisational, psychological and spiritual factors play in the well-being of Christian workers, so clergy, missionaries, chaplains, youth workers, all that kind of stuff. And so that's been a real love of mine over the past 10 years for sure, looking to explore how do we think about that and how can we promote that amongst people. Yeah.
10 years ago, what got you into doing that research?
Yeah, so I've actually been serving with Power to Change full time since 1999. But very early on, I saw people in ministry, not just Power to Change, friends in clergy ministry, people overseas. I saw people not doing very well over time, not doing very well psychologically, not doing very well spiritually. And when people would leave, they would leave very badly. And so my real interest was not just being involved in ministry myself, but how do we encourage one another to prevent us falling back in to struggling? So it was actually just seeing people struggling is what got me interested in that for sure.
And 10 years on, Grant, do you think the landscape has shifted? Similar issues, different issues?
Yeah, the landscape certainly has shifted. We've had a pandemic that's caused changes. Things are changing all the time, I think, for the better or worse. There's just so many different factors in play. Our culture's changing, how Christian workers are perceived. I think that has changed over 10, 15 years for sure. That's changed the dynamic. It's changed how people might look at a person or see them or evaluate them. I think there's a much greater recognition of struggle and what impact that has on things. With the COVID pandemic, there's a whole lot of change there, which brought about a whole lot of loss and a whole lot of grief. And have we recovered from that? I'm not sure. All kinds of things actually, I think, have changed, Valerie. But yeah, I don't know if I'd say for the better or worse. Actually, there's just lots of different things going on.
I mean, you mentioned the grief and the loss. What do you see? What is the grief and loss? Where is it coming from?
Well, I think grief in ministry is a big deal, actually, and not well appreciated. For me, every time there's a change, even a positive change, there's likely going to be some loss. And wherever there's loss, there's going to be grief. But often, maybe we don't think about it like that. So I think there can be lots of losses involved. There might be losses in terms of relationships. Things might change, relationships might change. I might lose contact with people, or the relationship, I still have contact, but it's not the same as what it was before. There's grief involved with that. I think there can be grief involved with just, am I going to be okay? Things are changing around me. Maybe my work environment's changed. am I going to be okay? Or am I going to be safe? Or will this be able to go on? Or is this viable? Will I be okay? Maybe that's a bit of a loss of safety and security. Relationship safety and security. Sometimes, particularly with the pandemic, there can be a real loss of competence. I thought I was competent at this role. The role has changed, or I'm being required to do different things, and all of a sudden I don't feel competent anymore.
Yeah.
The old saying, promoted to my level of incompetence, sometimes that occurs. And well, there's a loss there. There's a loss of competence. And that's a very significant thing. Sometimes there's losses in terms of just my mission and purpose. Maybe I had a great desire to do X, but because of Y and Z, things have changed, and actually I'm no longer going to be able to do X at all. Well, there's a grief there, actually. So grief can occur, I think, in a myriad of ways in ministry that might not necessarily be easily identified as that. Those losses, they accumulate.
And Grant, did you pick that up 10 years ago? Was that something you looked into, or has this been much more emergent as you've, interacted in this space?
Oh, it's much more emergent. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Although in exploring with people where some of the distress comes from, it usually is around some of those things. An accumulation of these things over time can become really quite wearing. So my energy can be drained or eroded.
Because I think I wanted to ask you, 10 years on, I see you really as having kickstarted the conversation around resilience in ministry, well-being in ministry, burnout. And typically one sees burnout as an occupational phenomenon, being that we're not just saying to the individual, toughen up or self-care or work on your individual factors. It is the intersection, isn't it? When you think about your research and the pandemic, grief and loss issues, one almost can feel like, well, what is there to do? It's a systems issue. It's not like we can reverse the pandemic. It's not like we can take away the stressors. And if the individual is possibly doing the best that they can, how do we actually view that? Do you know what I mean? From the framework of an occupational phenomenon.
Great. It's a great question. I would always say that. I would say burnout is a systemic issue. But when I'm burning out, it feels like a deeply personal issue. It's me. I'm failing. I'm not good enough. I'm not resilient enough, or whatever the phrase is. I really affirm what you've said. It is a system issue. However, I am complicit with my system. And so there are individual factors going on here. And so I think it's possible to discuss and identify what are the systemic issues, and maybe what are some resources that could enable us to engage on that system level. Now, that might involve then some systemic change. And I think that is possible because we're not passive agents in our environment. We are active agents. And I know that can seem hard to hear sometimes because it's like, well, I don't lead a congregation of 200. I've got 200 bosses, is how one might feel. But I think we do have agency to affect some change. That's one thing. Then there are individual issues that can actually help keep negative dynamics in place. And so we do need to have an awareness of, well, what role am I playing? How am I complicit to this? What are my own background or personal factors that might be even exacerbating some of the negative impacts of the environment? So one thing I'd say is I think we can have a go at changing the environment. We're not totally passive. But there are also individual issues that we can explore as well. So there's going to be both of those things is going to be important. I think very rarely is it all one or all the other. However, some environments one should never have to be resilient in. Some environments are abusive.
Mm.
And so in that environment, one needs to leave.
Mm.
So there's a few ideas around that issue about the systemic versus the individual, and the interplay is actually quite important. I must say, sometimes I've seen organisations who, in my experience, most organisations want people to do well. They really do. Leaders often want their people to do well. But sometimes the provision of resources is either not understood, or I'm just too exhausted to take up the extra opportunity. When I really have no energy, then even giving me a positive challenge that will help can feel like a hindrance that I just can't cope with. So there's a lot of things, a lot of moving parts in this discussion. I wish it was as simple as a one solution. There's no silver bullet here. We're complicated, and we're in dynamics that are very complicated. And the Christian ministry environment is a complicated area. Yeah.
Well, let's go through some of my findings and see how it maps, or what you found in your research, but also in your practice, because you still continue to practice as a psychologist and you still are very much seeing ministry workers. So about 35% of my sample endorsed, so around 200 ministers endorsed moderate to high levels of burnout as measured by my questions. Does that surprise you?
No. Well, Valerie, we've had this discussion before. The devil is in the details with research and numbers and moderate to very high. So a lot of it depends upon what measure we're using. But that does not surprise me, apart from I thought it would be even a little higher. I thought it would be higher, actually.
Yeah.
Clergy in general have higher levels of burnout than the average population. So Christian workers will have elevated levels of burnout, full stop. So it depends upon what's the group we're norming those numbers on. But Christian workers often have high levels of motivation as well. And so the strain or the stress from work usually is higher for Christian workers because it's so important. And because I'm so motivated to do it, and it's infused with the divine. So to be honest, does 35% surprise me? No, apart from I thought it might be a bit higher. So I would probably say, that's probably my experience. Yeah.
Okay. And about 35% seriously thought of leaving the ministry in the last 12 months.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. I've heard of other research floating around that definitely post-pandemic, 1 in 3 clergy are seriously considering leaving their role. So that rings true to me.
And top 3 reasons. My family suffers. I feel lonely and isolated, which were in the high 70s, percentage-wise, because you could endorse a few of these. My family suffers, I feel lonely and isolated were in the high 70s, and 49% indicated the immense stress of the job.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting. I think people who go into ministry, there's a degree of self-sacrifice to start with. So the immense stress of the job, one might think, oh, that should have been higher. Oh, maybe not. Maybe that's about expectations. There is an expectation that this is going to be, that I might suffer or something like that. The 76%, when I see my family suffering, there's a different motivational pull then to change something. So I thought that was interesting, and I would agree. When
Mm.
push comes to shove, I might get used to being in a dynamic where I am, a bit of a self-sacrificial servant. And I can even have some theological justifications, rightly or wrongly, for that.
Mm.
But when I see my family suffering,
Mm.
I often like to ask people this question. If you consider your experience and what your life is like serving Jesus in your role, would you wish that for one of your most loved family members? And if I can't say yes, there's an issue there. And what I'm trying to pull on is a bit of this issue.
Yeah.
Is that people who I love, I would not wish this on anyone, but I'll take this myself. And then that deserves some exploration. So what really jumped out at me was that 76%. That was I thought it's interesting for these family suffers. And I would agree. I think that's a powerful motivator.
Yeah.
The lonely and isolated, that is absolutely 100% true, particularly when you're talking about your sample, which is heavily skewed for males, older males. Definitely, I would think that's a big issue. That's a big issue, full stop. What I was also interested with that statistic, though, is that there's quite a large percent. I think it was like 80% of your sample was in multi-staff positions.
Mm.
Now, I thought that was interesting. So definitely that would be true for an individual
Mm.
in a sole pastoral position. Makes sense. What I thought was interesting about that was 75%, well, 80% of your sample was actually in like a 1 to 5 to more than 10 staff situation.
Good pickup, Grant.
Now that's interesting.
Mm.
Why is it that I can't speak to my colleagues about feeling isolated and alone?
Mm.
I know that it can be true. Sometimes when I'm in ministry, I don't want to acknowledge to my peers, particularly those who I work with, that I'm thinking about leaving.
Mm.
There's a whole lot of letting people down, letting God down, whatever. I just thought that was interesting. 75% so isolated, alone. That's why they're thinking of leaving. And 80% of them, well, who knows? I haven't looked at that. We haven't looked at that, but 80% of them are they're in teams. So yeah. So those top three reasons I thought were interesting, and they kind of make sense. I found them interesting. Yeah.
Have you picked up those dynamics in your publications?
Oh no. So I haven't measured loneliness myself, but in talking to Christian workers,
Absolutely.
I know, and in my organisation, I do staying interviews for our missionaries who've been around for a while. I do debriefs. I do exit interviews,
Mm.
and yeah, there is that sense within us of I don't want to let my people down. Have I talked to people about this beforehand? I used to find out all this information in exit interviews. I thought if only we'd known this earlier. And that's why now, after people have been involved for 2 years in our organisation, we do a staying interview. And basically, it's the same questions, don't tell anyone, as the exit interview.
Well, you're on a podcast, it's going to be broadcast.
but you find out this stuff early.
Yeah.
And it's like, there's multiple factors. There's going to be factors about job fit. That's going to be important. There's going to be factors about recovery and workload and balance and that kind of thing. There's going to be stuff about irritations that are really now starting to rub and form the blister. There's going to be stuff about longevity issues, financial viability, and all manner of things. You find out all manner of things. My point is that when people leave, they usually don't leave for just one issue, probably three or four or five. But here's a chance to get a bit of a pulse early about what are some of the pressure points that we could do something with now, while there's still some motivation and desire. Yeah.
That's a great point, Grant. It makes me stop to think that it also then depends on what you measure or what you're asking. Because if there are multiple points, it's almost like you've got to be aware of what those points are that are going to impact, right? So from your experience, just from asking those questions at the 2-year mark, just anecdotally even, what would be some of the common multiple reasons?
Oh, yep. Well, it's probably at 8 to 10. And usually I think there's going to be some degree of unmet expectations.
Mm.
So expectations for me to be more successful in ministry than I am. Expectations to have seen more than I do. Expectations to not do as much admin as I'm doing. So there's going to be probably some degree of unmet expectations, either about my own ministry success or about maybe my own spirituality or something. Unmet expectations. There's probably going to be some degree of job misfit. Because there's so many things Christian workers have to do. You've got to be good at all these different things. And some of them we might be good at, and some of them that's what we got into ministry for. But now I've also got to intervene with conflict, and I've also got to raise funds, and I've also got to manage volunteers, and I've also got to, be a counsellor, and I've also got to be a great scholar. Now, not all of those things are going to fit me. And so how do I figure out where are the ones that are draining me, particularly where are the ones that are actually I'm thriving in, and how do we manage that? There's going to be some type of job redesign. Often there's ambiguity. What am I meant to be doing? I can feel like I'm never doing enough, or I'm never good enough, because how do I measure what I'm doing? How do I stop for a weekend or a day off if I feel like I don't know if I've done enough this week? So there's ambiguity. We could go on. All that's going to lead to work overload probably. But then these other things you've mentioned, isolation, that can be there. That's probably going to be there. Just spiritual vitality. Often we can live 18 months off our initial, so spiritual vitality is going to be in there. There might be some financial concerns. There's a whole lot. The change of society or the change in roles. There's a few of the ones that.
This is the midpoint of the interview that you might want to take a break, simply walk away and reflect, or you might want to keep going. Just take note that in the description, you will find downloads for the show notes, some reflection questions you might want to ponder, as well as the full report. Keep going or stop now.
Often do come up. Yeah.
Now, given that ministry personnel generally don't have great levels of self-awareness in general, if you're asking these questions, are people able to answer with self-awareness, or do you have to know what to ask?
I don't think the questions I ask are particularly amazing. I will ask questions like, what are some of the things you just really love? What are some of the things you're really finding difficult? And then I'll think about different categories of what you might find difficult. The actual role, parts of your role, relationships, your own personal life, recovery, family. So I'm not asking rocket science, but questions. But I find people are pretty good. The reason why we do this around the 2-year mark is that's when you start to feel the hot spot. When you go for a long run, if you're a long runner, not that I'm not, I am, but anyway, so I'm told. I've done a lot of walking maybe. But before you get a blister, you'll get what they call a hot spot in the place that will form into a blister. Around the 2-year mark, the initial shine has often worn off. And as you know, the big issue with burnout is the chronicity of the exhaustion. And so you can suck it up for maybe a year,
Mm.
pushing out to 18 months, but you're probably going to start to see
Yeah.
some hotspots arise then.
Yeah.
So by the time we're starting to ask these questions with a little bit of probing,
Yeah.
people are aware when they're struggling. And if there's a relationship of trust or security, people are already quite open. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, now interesting that you say if there's a relationship of trust and security. If I jump to the personal violence questions that I asked, which
Really interesting.
in the last 12 months, the level of offensive behavior experienced by you personally. Now, again, I didn't really define this. It's a little bit like a test of projection. It's how you interpret it. And you can endorse more than one as well. So you can see that some really sad things, threats of violence, sexual harassment, physical violence, was endorsed. And then we've got feeling bullied, being subject to unpleasant teasing, conflicts and quarrels, gossip and slander. What jumped out at you when you saw that?
Well, the conflicts and quarrels that makes total sense. I haven't thought much about gossip and slander, but that's high. I thought that was high. And again, like what are people meaning when they're saying that? But that's high. Bullying, yeah, I'm not surprised at that. In fact, I wouldn't have been surprised if that was even a little bit higher. Because often when people are involved in conflicts and quarrels, particularly when depends upon the church, but there's a and depends on the denomination, but there's a point of vulnerability if I am quarreling with influential parishioners, to be honest. There's a point of real vulnerability, and I can feel bullied in a conflict. So I was interested by that. I thought that might have been a bit higher, but I was interested as well in terms of looking at the correlations, how conflicts and quarrels had more of a drain than bullying. Now that really surprised me. So again, I'm just thinking, wow, what is going on there? But it does go to the point of what are we doing with conflict? How do we disagree well and remain unified rather than seeing, unless we agree 100% about things, we need to be in this protracted conflict. So I think the way we think about conflict, I think that's an area that really deserves a lot more work. Like I think about John Gottman and his work or approach with conflict in a marital state, and I think that has a lot of legs for Christian workers, actually.
Yeah, I agree. As a business, we're really turning our eye to the psychosocial hazards of a workplace because we've got legislation. And I was struck by how much of this dynamic, the constant conflict, feeling like you're going to a workplace where maybe you're not liked, people don't agree with you, that people are going to say stuff about you and your family. From a psychosocial hazards as an employer, knowing what's going on in your workplace, that if someone is turning up to that every day, that's just going to build up, right? Because your livelihood is tied to it. And in ministry, your sense of calling, conviction, your love for Jesus and knowing the consequence of what happens when people don't know Jesus, you kind of get a sense of you're trapped. Like, how do you get out of this space? And maybe an assumption that, but this is, I often hear this, Grant, when I'm out, but isn't this what ministry is meant to be all about? It's a tough gig. You're right. Nobody signed up for an easy job. You're always going to have conflict. And yet I can see from the standards in the workplace, we wouldn't say that.
Yeah, that's true. And that's when you get into the zone of post-traumatic stress symptomology. whatever you want. I'm not wanting to,
I agree with you. No, let's
talk
go.
about diagnoses and stuff, but just trying to say there's symptomology there where I'm learning and I'm learning that this is not a safe place and I'm helpless.
Yeah. And, you talked about the cognitive deficits. If we kind of, look at the whole picture, and it's nice to be able to bounce this with a fellow psychologist, because this has probably been on my heart for a long time, is, when you talk about the cognitive deficits, this level of chronic stress, this level of toxicity and conflict, rejection that you feel, lack of safety, plus the pandemic, it will eat into those resources, from a psychological health, but just from how much your own body and mind can cope with. So I'm looking at this because I think I told you this, but this was my last minute question that I threw in. I was like, hey, let's just see if some of what I'm seeing walk into our clinic door, whether people will endorse these items. I'm really concerned. And at which point do we say this is normal ministry conflict? Do you know, Grant?
Yeah. And I don't know. I think also because like a therapist will certainly have a skewed perspective because of, well, who does a therapist see? People who are struggling, and so obviously that's true. But yes, the idea about this is what should be expected in ministry, I'm just not very satisfied with that. I don't like the sound of that. Like I can appreciate where some people might be coming from for that, but just the damage that it does to people, and then to their families, and then to the children of those families. That really, I just find that very distressing. Yes. So yeah, we're talking here probably about the difference between conflict versus bullying, workplace incivility area. And I think that whole workplace incivility literature would be helpful to look at in terms of what is acceptable, what isn't acceptable. And hey, let's face it, I know there's legislation out there about bullying and stuff, but companies outside of the church, it's not like they're doing great here. But there's something about inside the church where our views are turbocharged with our spiritual convictions that can just leave people actually forgetting to behave like the person who founded our faith in the first place. So anyway, Sorry, I'm just blabbing on here.
No, I think that's interesting what you said about workplace incivility. Again, as an employer, I'm reflecting because we're going through our work health safety procedures and going through our handbooks, and the number of times we've had to update it, Grant, to stay not just relevant to legislation, but new things happen in the world, like new kinds of unkindness happen in the world. Like we've got to be aware of what's appropriate and inappropriate to put into your social media interactions with one another as staff. What is appropriate in terms of what is a fatigue, how do you define fatigue in the workplace? Like it's not just as simple as your workload, but there's all these other things: demand, pace, decision-making, the amount of responsibility you have, the risk that you hold in a job as well, right? And we've just been going through our own handbook, and to some extent it does define to us what is considered professional conduct, and also what is considered conduct that keeps yourself and your workmates safe. not just the heavy lifting things, or, whether or not you're using equipment unsafely, but workplace dynamics, what is actually considered appropriate and inappropriate, and having constant conversations about what is appropriate and inappropriate in the workplace. And I wonder whether that's part of the confusion in churches, because we know we're meant to love one another. We know we're meant to serve one another. We know we're meant to be other person centered. But how do we then know when we're just being selfish or demanding, or even threatened about our own position? Like, I feel so strongly about this, and you don't, and one of us is wrong, and I know it's not me, and I'm willing to put a gospel stake on that.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, and I think another difficulty is with the dynamic is that when I go to church, I don't go to church as it's my workplace. Now, for my minister, it is their workplace, but it's not my workplace, and so there can be like a bit of a disconnect from the community about, well, what is this place?
Yeah.
What are I'm a little looser, maybe. It's a little more like my family.
Yeah.
So there can be a bit of that kind of stuff too, playing in. Like how do I view what I'm doing here from a Christian worker perspective? It's my workplace. For others, it's not, and that just adds to that in the complexity of lines of authority and expectations, and yeah.
And so if we look at the picture now, this happy picture loneliness, thinking, worrying that my family suffers, plus the work stress, and now this conflict. The picture that I'm wondering is, how do you get yourself out of that? Or what resources, from your model, really speaks into that space?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I can say a lot about that. One thing I would just say would be, this material is great to look at together with people who are Christian workers, clergy. But to be honest, I think we need to talk about it, not just with a person who's someone who's in the clergy, but actually as the community. Yeah. So for the eldership or the parish council, or just the other people appreciate what's it like for these people who we're looking to lead us. So I think there's something about just the appreciation or listening to one another about one another's experience in the community. I think that's really important. But the first thing that I want to probably think about is looking at, well, what are some of my biggest demands? Like, there's a whole lot of things in the research here, but what's some of the biggest ones for me? And I would just start with a bit of problem-focused coping there. What can we do to take some action on that? What would be some resources that could help us cope with that, or to help us change that, or to help us get rid of that, or to help us? So I would say, what's some job resources that could help me deal with my job demands? I'd certainly also want to be thinking about then my own spiritual life, and trying to work out, what is it that God is asking of me? And what is he not asking of me? What are my core convictions or callings? And where have I been pulled away from those where I'm trying to do other things that maybe are inappropriate? So I would certainly want to start with having a good, clear idea about what is my particular areas of pressure, and what could we start to do about that as a community. So I said the word looking for resources to help, but I really think within the community, that's where I think we need to discuss that together. So one thing is actually for someone to try to share that with a warden or a elder or the eldership. I definitely want to say something about that to give a bit of the reality of what's going on, so that people understand. Yeah.
Have you got any positive examples where that's being worked out in the context of, someone who's burnt out, lonely, high conflict in the church? Have you seen some encouraging?
I have, and I have actually, and that's sometimes what I mean by there's a bit of a complicit. I can be complicit with what's going on around me,
Yeah.
because often my own fear of failure, my own desire to be approved of, my own interest to not be rejected, or to have me live up to my own unrelenting standards. Yeah, all of that stuff prevents me from saying, hey, you know what? I don't think I can keep working 64 hours a week.
Mm, mm,
Um,
mm,
and so I have seen some positive things around that
mm,
when the community has an understanding of that person's current experience.
mm.
But that can be difficult. I'm not saying it always works, but I actually have seen that work. Yeah.
Mm. And is there a difference in terms of how long you've stayed in the conflict? Like you were saying that, you find that the 2-year mark is a good one. Is this something that maybe just routinely we preempt by going, your first 2 years in the role, let's keep in close contact, close communication, close perspective trading between yourself and your parish council, or yourself and your congregation?
Yeah, that's a good point, Valerie. Yeah. Um, what I like about the 2-year mark is that it's done then with someone who's external to their everyday environment.
Mm,
So sometimes within a team where there's a lot of constant monitoring, it can kind of lose a bit of its. It's almost like the water temperature is rising, but the frog's still saying, "Yeah, I feel fine." where maybe every 6 months,
mm.
um, and that's why it's helpful to have a little bit of an external person as well.
Okay.
So to have someone like yourself or your practice, have someone check in and go through some kind of key questions, and even the odd ticker box thing that can just take a bit of the pulse. That could be helpful. I think what is really helpful too in terms of that within the team is just having something like a clear personal development plan or a self-care plan and a clear job description that has my particular focuses or foci that I can now that could be good to measure every couple of months.
Mm.
It's not some. I beg your pardon.
Who defines that?
I think that's got to be defined by both, and it depends upon seniority. So in the team context, that's what I'd say. So if I'm brand new into a role, then yeah, I'm going to be doing lots of different things. I might not have as much of a say in my role because I'm new and I'm learning, I'm trying. But same with the personal development plan. I think there's got to be a conversation that has to happen about that. But I would say that kind of like a personal development or self-care plan combined with a bit of my role focus, I think there's some things that do go well in a team context that can be touched on regularly. Some of the more kind of psychological stuff, yeah, I just don't want people to get too used to it, if you know what I mean. I don't, yeah, just some thoughts. Yeah, I don't know if it's right.
I don't know either. This is why I think we've got to labor together. I think you're right. It's as a community, isn't it? So, I mean, some of the positive examples we've seen is certainly where a congregation and their ministry staff have a lot more personal connection as well, not just with the role. They're doing things together, just building their friendships and taking the time to understand the family situation as well. Allaying some of the stress and the threat and the fears that are, my kids, they're not, they're not going to sit still in church, and congregation members just coming around that and going, mine didn't either. Just really normalizing that. And then it's almost like you've got, personality qualities that we want in our ministry leaders. It's also then having those qualities in people in the church, being really open, being curious, being looking to see how they can create some out of the box solutions, maybe letting go a little bit of, well, the last minister did it this way, or we really like having it done this way, to kind of have a conversation of not so much that this is going to change our church, but because I know you and I know your family, and I'm understanding that you guys have, this unique history or situation. Let's have a look and see what we can sort of, figure out around you as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Like that's the ideal, where there's a genuineness on both sides. Yeah, that's right.
And I think we've also seen it really work when churches work together in a seasonal approach as well, that what's happening now in the ministry family's life, can change in the next few months or the next 6 months, as their kids change, or that, you have aging parents or health and things like that. And it kind of relaxing into a rhythm as well, that this might be okay for now, or this might be really difficult for now. We might be able to sort of have a conversation a couple of months down the line, or let's just try this for now. Yeah.
Again, I think that's excellent, and it's that engagement together, like as a body. We're a body, and we've got to play our roles, and just needing to do that together is really important. Yeah.
I'm really keen to ask you one more bit about the research, because you and I went back and forth. I really appreciated your stretching me in thinking about my questions. But, some of the destructive leadership behaviors, which I've basically said, I pulled out a couple of questions from the literature that was more about forceful and inappropriate leadership, not narcissistic personality disorder, not toxic or abusive. But, ministers being asked, if you were honest, in the last 12 months, did you use a kind of blaming, punitive, forceful type of leadership? And that relationship with burnout. So either way, obviously, you could be tired and burnt out and use these behaviors, or use these behaviors, and then as a result, the consequence is that, you create mess for yourself and you get tired. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think both of them are true, for sure. 100%. Because usually there's a dynamic between leaders and a team where if we're the transformational leader, even if we're the transformational leader, we're working together, looking for a common goal. I'm playing a role as a leader, but it's that role we're playing together to get to our common. That's the ideal. But even there, if I'm playing my role as a leader, I'm really trying to serve the team to help us get to our common goal.
Yeah.
But if I perceive that people that I'm trying to serve are not empowering my leadership, it's pretty easy for me to stop serving and start demanding. And if I'm trying to empower someone's leadership and I perceive that they've stopped serving, they've started demanding, I'm going to stop empowering their leadership. So I think there's a cycle there It's not so much empowering the leader, empowering the team. Actually, it's the opposite. As a team member, I need to empower my leader to enable them to do their role to help us get to our common goal. Where I perceive that they're stopping to serve me to get us to our common goal. I don't mean serve me as in that, but the leader's got to be, actually, yeah, I'm serving us in our role to get there. I will stop empowering them, and vice versa. If I perceive as a leader someone who's not empowering my leadership, I will stop serving and I'll start demanding. So that can come from the dynamic, or it can just come, I'm too tired to go through all of this. You always do this. You need to blah, blah, blah. Because I just don't have the energy anymore.
Yeah. I mean, the more you and I are talking, I mean, I would love to ask you, do you have like a concrete example of that first one where, you said that transformational leadership is about the follower empowering the leader. What does that look like?
It means that I recognize that we are actually all together moving towards our common goal. And as we're doing that, each of us have different roles to play. As Romans 12 says, if your gift is leadership, then lead. And so if someone has the role of the leader, then I need to actually accept their leadership over me. Now, what does that look like? Well, it means I'm going to allow them to make the odd call that I might not agree with. It means that I'm going to actually, if they set a boundary about what's appropriate, what's not appropriate in order to move forward, I'm going to be willing to work within that. I'm not going to be I'll just agree to everything. But there's something about me, I need to accept someone's leadership. You can't force someone to follow you. You can force them to comply, but you can't force them to genuinely follow. And so same with me, I must accept someone's leadership if we're going to cooperate together in a really significant manner. I must accept their leadership. You think about an orchestra where there's a conductor up the front. They've got a job to do. And me playing the whatever, I've got to accept their leadership. And even if I think I should be playing a lead break here on my violin, so
there's a boundary to that, isn't there, though, Grant?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not saying this is
willing followership is not necessarily blind followership. So clearly, yeah.
In fact, absolutely not. Absolutely not. You need people to speak up, because in the room, one of us is never going to be smarter than everyone. So we need people to speak up. And we're getting into issues of, well, how does a team make decisions? When do we have collaborative leadership, decision making? When do we have consensus? When do we have just a one? We're moving more into that discussion now. But all I'm trying to say is that a team needs to accept their leader if the leader is going to do the role. And if I feel like my leadership is not accepted, I will end up forcing and looking for compliance. And that is not going to be a transformational experience. We're going to move towards maybe some of these more destructive means. Yeah.
To finish up, 3 questions, Grant. If there is a pastor listening to our conversation and there's just one thing they can walk away with, one thing to make the difference, what would you want them to know or do or think about?
I would really want them to focus on their identity in Christ. I would just want to say that you are much more than your work role. You are an image bearer of the divine. Who the Father would say over you in Christ, you are my child whom I love. With you, I'm well pleased. If you're really exhausted, you might need to hear the words that Jesus said to his disciples when they came back from their first missionary journey. He said to them, "Come with me by yourself to a quiet place and get some rest." We need to rest first and then attune to the Lord Jesus. I don't mean that, like you go up on a mountainside and come down. I mean in community. They're the first two things I would say. Think about your identity, not just your work role. You're different. Meaningful work is important. Meaningful ministry is important. But you're more than that. You're an image bearer of the divine, who the Holy Spirit is at work at. I would say that, and then I'd say also just about to come back and listen to the Lord Jesus afresh. Take some time to replenish your energy to do that. The other thing I want to say to you is this. Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Because of what you're doing, you've transformed lives like mine. You've changed. My life has been changed because of people like you who are labouring in church. Thank you. Not only thank you for me, I thank you for my spouse, who I relate to very differently than I would. I thank you also for my kids, and that their lives are totally different because of your work in my life. Your role is incredibly significant, incredibly significant. And so I really want to applaud you. As 1 Timothy says, you are worthy of double honor. And I really mean that. What you're doing, I know sometimes we can say things like, what impact am I really having here? But in 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100 years' time, there will be a legacy. There'll be legacy in individuals, families, and generations that you probably won't even know about. But it is happening. And so I just really want to say thank you for your role.
Oh, Grant. And if there was a church that, was listening to us and they walked away, what is one thing you would want them to think or do or act on after listening to us?
Really seek to understand your ministry worker. Understand. Seek to understand, not just conflict with. Understand. Give them the gift of them knowing you understand what they're going through. The gift of understanding. Before we can help someone, they need to know we understand them. And so I'd say before making big policy changes or saying, hey, look, I got an idea, let's take your preaching off your plate for the next 6 weeks. Before doing any of that, understand. Try to understand and stick with that. Be curious, ask questions until that person can say of you, yes, you get me.
And finally, Grant, if someone who's at the policy making denomination level listening into us, sort of really thinking about from a systems point of view, what's one thing you'd like them to walk away with?
I find that harder. I would say to ask your people what would help them. So I have seen, I'd say what would help them. And because sometimes we and I do it. I'm in headquarters of our organisation, and I roll out these initiatives, and they're great, but no one takes them up because. So I would say we need to ask what will help them, and I'd say in there's going to be three areas.
Mm.
I would ask, what can we do to help you to see progress in your ministry?
Right. Mm.
What bottom line progress in your ministry?
Mm.
What can we do to make that happen?
Mm.
Not hinder
Mm.
you from doing that. So that's one thing. What would help you to see bottom line progress? What can we do? The second thing I'd ask is, what can we do to have you be fed spiritually? Because we give out when we're in Christian ministry, and it can be hard to receive, to be ministered to.
Mm.
Is that spiritual direction? Is that, I don't know, some conferences, key conferences that
Yeah.
people like?
Yeah.
So one, what can help you see progress in your ministry? Two, what will feed you spiritually? And then three, I would ask the question, what's your biggest strain? What's the biggest stressor in your life? And I'm asking that question so that I can think about, how can we actually relieve that in some
Yeah.
way?
Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be the three things. Mm.
Well, Grant, it's been wonderful. I've really thoroughly enjoyed our conversation, and I'm so grateful for your time. Thank you so much, Grant.
Thanks, Valerie. Always lovely to see you. Yeah.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you liked what you heard and you think others should hear it too, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Catch you later.